So let's begin with, first of all, this new US aid package for Ukraine. Before we unpack some of the outcomes of the meeting of EU foreign policy and defence ministers, what impact do you think this new aid package is going to have on the battlefield in Ukraine, and will it make a material difference?
Yeah, I think it'll make a really big difference. The Ukrainian forces have been struggling for ammunition and anti-aircraft and missile munitions. They've been having to ration them because they don't have very many left. So even though these munitions aren't going to get there for maybe a week or two, they can already start, even today, in the knowledge that the new supplies are going to get there. They don't have to ration anymore because they know they're about to get a fresh new set of supplies. I don't think it'll make a material, decisive difference. It doesn't mean Ukraine is suddenly going to roll forward, but it does mean the danger that Ukraine was going to be pushed back over the second half of this year is now much less likely.
Middle East politics seem to be overshadowing the war in Ukraine, though. That's bad news for Volodymyr Zelensky, is it not?
I mean, in a sense, I don't think it should make too much of a difference. What they have been looking for is this extra slug of money that will allow them to get the weapons that they need, the shells and the missile batteries. And so now they've got that, then in a sense they're reasonably well set to do what they need to do. And so as long as there isn't an actual war in the Middle East that will distract these weapons supplies, then Ukraine now has what it has been asking for, and it should now be able to get on with what it needs to do on the battlefield.
Nevertheless, it seems like European policymakers are a little at odds here, particularly across the capitals, about how to respond on the question of what Ukraine should receive and who's going to pay for it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always divisions. I mean, you just saw on your introduction there the issue of who should send more of these anti-missile batteries. Some countries want to keep them for themselves. Some countries just don't feel they don't want to give up the supplies. So there are divisions about who should do what. But I think the EU has been reasonably united. It's sending more money, it's sending more weapons, and it is agreeing new sanctions against Iran. So there's a degree of European unity there.
Who gets the Patriots? Who's going to give the Patriots, rather?
No, that I don't know. As you saw, only one system has been given, so there's going to have to be pressure, and you could see the frustration on Josep Borrell, the High Representative there. So I think there's going to have to be a round of pressure to see who they can push forward.
Right. And what's at risk for Ukraine if it doesn't get those weapon systems?
Well, the challenge is that the Russians, because they have not quite an unlimited, but great supplies of these missiles, can just launch a whole bunch of them into Ukrainian territory. And so it damages power supplies, it damages morale in cities. And the challenge is it's very expensive. The drones and missiles are quite cheap, and the anti-drone systems are very expensive. So you need to keep spending a lot of money to stop these things getting through.
Can I also ask you about this latest round of sanctions against Iran as well? European policy leaders appear to be on side. Do we have any clarity on what that's going to look like, though, and where the ultimate impact on Iran will be?
I think a lot of these things are symbolic. One of the things the Europeans have been talking about is whether they should declare the Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization. It doesn't make a huge difference. The same is true with the sanctions that the Europeans and the Americans put on a couple of days ago on an Iranian drone maker, one of the drone makers that was responsible for the drones that were used in the attack. So a lot of these sanctions are symbolic. However, the European ones are often more important because the US has sanctioned pretty much everything that it can. So the Europeans at least have a little bit more leeway in terms of what's left to sanction in relation to the Iranian regime.
Let's talk about some other policy avenues as well. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is going to be inbound to China. And the question of China's leverage over Russia here in its war against Ukraine has also been a major talking point. What policy power does the US have to convince China to come alongside here? Or is that an perhaps impossible task at this point, given China's strong support for Russia and its leader?
It's not that it's not that China's going to come alongside. It's that the US, both when Janet Yellen went last week and now Blinken this week, it has identified the fact that the Chinese are supporting Russia indirectly. They're providing weapons-linked technology. So they're not sending shells, they're not sending missiles, but they're sending circuit boards that might be useful if you're trying to launch weapons. And the US is trying to draw a red line and say, we don't want you doing that. And if you do that, then there are going to be sanctions on Chinese-linked entities. So the patience has run out on the US side.
So what good will Secretary Blinken do in China, and what can he realistically achieve, given China's long-standing position here?
Well, I think China doesn't really have a long-standing position here. I mean, China has been very supportive of Russia, but it has been quite careful not to cross any of the US red lines in terms of sending weapons, for instance. And so I think there's some chance that if the US, in a sense, makes this a big issue and says that this is a real problem for us, that the Chinese will decide that they don't want to get into a fight with the US about this, because US-China relations have been on a very gentle upward path for the last little period, albeit from a low base, and China has been quite keen to stabilize relations with Washington. So with Blinken turning up and saying this is a big problem, I think there is a chance that China might look again and think, is it really worth us sending these circuit boards to Russia after all?
The trajectory of all of this changes, though, if Trump comes back in November, right?
I mean, that changes everything. So we will have to wait and see what happens with that.